All right, here we are in week three. By this time, some of you begin to wonder, is he wearing that same shirt for 3 straight weeks? And while it is one of my favorite shirts, it's a shirt that I bought after a 3 week backpacking trip with two of my daughters and a boyfriend of one of the daughters. Um, and we passed through Yosemite and bought this shirt. While it is one of my favorites, I have not been wearing it for 3 weeks. I have been wearing it, however, for 3 videos, and probably for the fourth, because I happen to be recording four of these all at once today on a rainy, sunny Sunday afternoon in Pasadena. So just for those of you who are fashion conscious, I wanted you to know that I don't wear the same shirt for 3 weeks or 4 weeks in a row. Okay, moving on from that very important theological tidbit, let's move into week three. And this week's video reflection is to kind of angle us into the discussion of Luke and Acts. We've done an introduction to culture. We've done some exploration of how cognitive environments are part of that and part of the whole complexity of communication, and evangelism and discipleship involve communication. And we've tried to look at how those could affect how different cultural themes that we've garnered from the Misreading Scripture book, which is trying to illuminate some biblical cultural dimensions that we might not see from a Western perspective. Tried to glean some things from that to help us understand cross-cultural communication related to evangelism and discipleship. We're now going to spend a couple of weeks looking at actual biblical texts, trying to get a framework biblically for evangelism and discipleship, and maybe to question some assumptions that we would have about that. So I'm having you start with Luke and Acts, and then we'll proceed to Galatians and 1 John. And we could have picked really anything in the New Testament. I picked these because Luke and Acts, as a combination of the four Gospels, picking Luke I did because Acts follows it and really is one author looking at a broad sweep of what happened in Jesus' ministry and in the earliest years of the expansion of that movement into other cultures. So as such, there's, this is a record of how the gospel was presented in different contexts and understood, how discipleship happened in different contexts and took shape. And it also will enable us in coming weeks to look through the lens of Luke and Acts to ask questions about how does discipleship, evangelism, and quote unquote church planting, not a term ever found in the New Testament per se. Paul does use the image of planting as a metaphor for his ministry, but not in anything close to the way we talk about church planting these days. And yet it is a framework that we need to discuss. What's the relationship of evangelism and discipleship to church planting? That's one of the course outcomes that I've outlined in the syllabus. So we want to address that. And Luke and Acts gives us ample material to kind of throw on the wall and see what sticks. So I'm really looking forward to that. So I just want to give a few comments as you're beginning to look through Luke and Acts. And the first is that I'd like you to, we do this actually in our training in my sending organization, Global Teams, and we did this in the earliest days of a movement in Pakistan that I was part of helping to kind of see flourish and grow and spread. I'm still very involved with that. But in the early days, we would often begin with new emerging leaders, either in Pakistan or in our organization, as we're training church planters, pioneer workers to go cross-culturally to unreached people groups. We'll often start, first of all, with Luke and Acts, simply having everybody look for all the locations where the gospel spread. So we just start with Luke 1:1 and Jerusalem, and we just, every time a village or a region or something like that is mentioned, or an ocean or a country, what we would call a country, is mentioned, we just note it down, and we draw a map on a whiteboard, and we just start, tracing all the lines back and forth throughout the ministry of Jesus, and then in the ministries of the apostles in Acts, Peter and Paul. Paul in particular, of course, comes to the forefront there. And what you see is a whole mess of interconnected lines and locations, and the spread of the gospel in a really short amount of time. Even if you start from Jesus' birth, and let's just call it year zero. I understand there's all these historical debates about whether he was born in 0 or 6 or 4, or etc. And if we go to the death of Paul somewhere in the mid 60s, that's a 65-year period. Now, keep in mind, Jesus didn't even get started until 30 years in. So it isn't a 65-year period. It's really roughly just over a 30-year period. And then if you narrow that even further, just down to the ministry of Paul, the extent of the spread of the gospel when Paul kind of comes on the scene, and then where things have gone by the time he dies, you're really talking, in Paul's case, of somewhere around 25 years. And the gospel has spread to every major city of the Roman Empire, the known Roman Empire at the time. There are leaders in place. There are churches planted, and rapidly. And so one of the things we like to do in our training is unpack all that and figure out the dynamics. The thing I want to angle in on as I have you read Luke and Acts is certainly pay attention to that spread, that geographical spread of the gospel, location by location. But keep in mind that each one of those locations is a window into a cultural barrier being crossed by the gospel. So what are those? Well, of course, primarily, you've got the Jewish and the Gentile worlds, right? But even that is simplistic. Let's just think about the Jewish world into which the gospel was spreading. You've got basically the Judeo-Palestinian world, and then, of course, the diaspora, more Hellenistic groups throughout the Roman Empire, just in the Jewish world. Even within the Judeo-Palestine world, you've got Judean and Galilean. Very different if you pay attention to the nuances. Even within that, you've got the different parties of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots and others. So you've got real cultural diversity. And we see this bearing out. You're going to come across this, of course, in Acts 6. What's going on in Acts 6 is not God deciding that we need deacons in the church and a lesson in church polity. What's going on is that there's a cultural clash within the emerging believers between Judean Jews and Greek Jews. Those are culture issues, linguistic issues, and they impact discipleship and evangelism. So the New Testament is extremely complicated and in terms of its cultural environments, and we really can't read it well without a sensitivity to what is going on there. What excites me about that is it is therefore a wonderful textbook for us in trying to understand how to do evangelism and discipleship cross-culturally, because it's happening right in front of our eyes as we read the text, if we attune ourselves to that and read it sensitively. So that's what I'm going to encourage you to do. I only gave the example of the incredible complexity of the cultural world of the Jewish dimension. I didn't even begin to talk about all the weird varieties of Gentiles as we go from, as we meet, even within Athens, for example, two whole different real cultural groups, the philosopher types, and then the sort of day-to-day market people who are actually worshiping idols and that sort of thing. You've got Corinth, which is its whole world. You've got Ephesus and the temple that's there. You've got different languages. You've got the Roman and the Greek worlds intersecting. And we see different ways that the gospel is communicated, disciples formed, types of community, shapes of community. If we read the letters carefully of Paul, there's all sorts of different ways that this plays out in terms of evangelism, discipleship, and as well as forms of church that are taking place. So we want to see that as it unfolds, and be paying attention to that as you read Luke and Acts this week. Blessings. I'll see you in the discussion rooms. Bye.